Hello YouTube, I hope you're having a great day today. Today I'm going to take a look at one of the classic science fiction novels of all time. It's Ursula K. LeGuin's The Left Hand of Darkness. It was published in the late 60s in 69, and she wrote it in 68. She wasn't a big name writer at the time, although she'd been writing for about 10 years, from about the late 50s, all to about the early 60s and so forth. But one of the key things about Ursula K. Le Guin is that she's a very strong writer, and this book is one that has been received well by everybody ever since it was published. It was in one of the top, it's still in top 10 lists going through today for one of the top 10 science fiction novels of all time. It also won a Hugo Award and a Nebula Award. Hugos are given out by science fiction fans, so the fans loved it. And of course the Nebula Award's given out by the Science Fiction Writer Hall of. So if you're one of the science fiction writers of America in that guild, then they give out the Nebula Award. So it was both awarded at the time by both the writers and also by the public too for the Hugo Award. So it won both. Actually, this is the first award ever by a woman in neither of those categories. So Ursula K. Le Guin would also win this too. Ursula K. Le Guin wrote mainly in two genres, science fiction and fantasy. Left Hand of Darkness is a science fiction classic, and so forth. So what I want to do for you today is kind of take a look and do a review for you, unpack it. I'll take a little bit about the context of the story, why it's so impactful, and why it's increasingly popular, and also how it kind of started and kick-started an entire subgenre of science fiction. So let's take a look. So the first thing I want to talk about, I actually knocked my book over, so I'm actually going to bend over just like 10 seconds and pick it up. But the first thing I want to talk about with you is that I do want to talk about the fact that there really are kind of two types of science fiction works that are out there. The first are merely those that sort of seek to entertain. Their goal is to be escape. I'll kind of classify them as kind of escapism. Works that look at escaping are going to be works that are going to be taking a look at getting, spending some time, getting away from it all. They're going to be fun. They're going to be interesting. They're not going to challenge the reader. They're not going to try to push anything, and so forth. They're just there to be there. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Lots of works, I think, for example, lots of military science fiction is going to tend towards being, escapist science fiction. And there should be lots of other works out there, too, that are going to be in a similar boat, that are going to be trying to escape. And that's fine. No problem with that. And there's kind of a second genre, and that's a genre that seeks to use science fiction in order to tell something about ourselves, to explore aspects of our own society. Oftentimes that can't be done through another venue. For example, Rod Serling would famously do this with The Twilight Zone, where he would examine issues that you would not have been able to examine without using science fiction and The Twilight Zone as the sort of tool to do that. By putting it in a science fiction context, he was able to explore issues like racism in the 50s and such. He also has a considerable number of shows, episodes, and so forth that are exploring popular topics, but because they're doing it from a science fiction angle, they're not necessarily going to have, they're going to be able to get past the censors and such. Lots of other writers or other people that were doing media did the same thing. Gene Roddenberry did this famously with Star Trek, for example, in the 60s, and later shows would do the same thing, use science fiction. He cast a Russian who was very, very Russian in Chekhov in the height of the Cold War, right after, the multiple major instances that happened with the Soviet Union and their allies, including the Cuban Missile Crisis. And right after the Cuban Missile Crisis, that was big. You have a black woman. You have, which is one of the first times that would happen. You had one of the first times you would have an Asian who had one of the lead roles, and so forth. So you had a lot of these sort of roles that were out there in Star Trek, and it would also explore a lot of things through a science fiction context about the world and society around us and have those conversations. And that would continue on throughout TNG and later Star Trek shows too. And everything from Deep Space Nine, which had a black leader, so we explored a lot of that black context and what that meant to be black in a science fiction universe and so forth. And that's not, Roddenberry's not the only person to do that. That's very popular. Robert Heinlein will do that. And many other people will too. And this is probably one of the best examples of that. Because again, what Ursula K. Le Guin is going to be doing is she's going to be looking at, in this case, gender and gender stereotypes and what they actually mean with this story. Now in this story, it's set in the far future where there is this coalition that's kind of loosely like a federation called the Ekumen, and they are going to be sending one of their sort of people, a diplomat, to this local colony, a far-flung colony, to see if they are ready to join the Ekumen. So that's the goal. So what you're going to be doing is you're going to be following throughout this story this person that they've sent, generally AI. His last name is spelled AI, so I'm going to pronounce it. It might be Ia or something like that. I don't know. But I'm going to be pronouncing it AI for you. But generally AI is going to be the person who's been sent to this Earth to dispatch to try to bring them into the Ekumen, see if they're ready for it, and so forth. But the problem is that because on this world there are no gender stereotypes, because there are no genders. The people who are on this Earth have formed a sort of society where and sort of a culture where they don't have a gender for most of the month, and then for 3 or 4 days in the month, based on the context, the relationship, and so forth, they'll form they'll take something that's called Kenner, and their body will take one of the two traditional male-female definitions, and their partner will take the other one of those two, and then they will be hypersexual for that 3 or 4 days, but there's not traditional sort of seduction, so forth, sexuality, and so forth. It's the community raises the children, those sorts of things. So anyway, so it's definitely a different sort of take. And by doing that, they give the opportunity to have a number of different stereotypes. So for example, the world has never had wars, but it has a whole lot more political intrigue than your normal science fiction place, and so forth. And our main character, as a male character, is also going to be our sort of point of view character, because he doesn't know what's going on, and so forth. And even though he spent some time trying to study the culture, he feels that there's just so many things of the culture that are foreign to him. So his goal is to meet up. So what he's going to do over the course of the book, there are two major kingdoms and kind of continents on this that are rivals. He's going to be using political intrigue and so forth. He's going to have allies that he doesn't trust, but he should, and he's going to have, the main one is Ekumen. Ekumen's going to start out as the prime minister of the country that generally is going to be trying to bring in to the fold, and what he's going to do is he's going to meet with that person, work with that person, and so forth, but he never trusts that person because he doesn't have that sort of, that person's not filling a traditional male role or a traditional female role. So it's hard for our main character, and thus us, to actually trust this local person and so forth, even though the local person has gone out of their way to welcome him, to get him a meeting with the king, and so on and so forth. Our main character AI just never fully trusts him and so forth. So what I'm going to do right there is I'm going to kind of put the pause button on the reviews, because I don't like to give out too many spoilers in the reviews. But what I do want to do is kind of explore what the kind of basic framework is going to happen with two major nations. You're going to need to bring them both in, and so forth, and with his allies on the planet, as well as again and enemies and so forth, and finding out the people who are welcoming him aren't, and people that aren't welcoming him are, and so forth, because he doesn't understand the social structures on a planet where there's no gender-based method for those social structures. And so that's kind of the interesting conversations that he's having and trying to figure this out, and so forth. There are these hidden written rules sort of conduct and honor and such that you need to make sure that you don't violate, that they're not written down in a guidebook or anything like that, that he needs to figure out and follow as well, which he doesn't do because he's not a native person to this planet, right? And there's not those sort of rules and structures in our society. Similarly, being in a society where there's no male or female in a traditional sense, but people have kind of one more unified gender, and that with gender roles and such, and so forth. But basically, the whole point of it is going to be sort of an exploration of thus gender roles, both in our own society as well as here, and what a society would look like if there was basically just one gender, and such. So that's kind of the idea of the story. Ursula K. LeGuin, again, will be the first one to kind of write this, and again, it's hugely awarded and so forth. So again, we'll leave the pause button there. I probably stopped you about 3 or 4 chapters into the novel with my basic overviews and such, and then I'll let the rest of it kind of breathe on its own. There's a lot more to follow, lots more political infighting that's going to happen, lots more actual fighting, some survival issues that are going to happen. People are going to get thrown into jail, bad things are going to happen to people. It's going to be fun. So you can go ahead and read that yourself. And again, put the pause button on the specific kind of the overview of the review. But what I want to focus on a little bit more for you is to kind of take more of a deeper look in kind of the philosophical issues that are explored here in The Left Hand of Darkness. Because again, one of the things that LeGuin is doing here is she's trying to bring to modern readers during the 60s that were coming in. They're going to be mostly male, right? So she wants to have this sort of a conversation about what that means to be male or female and so forth. And ultimately, one of the basic sort of points that's going to be made is that both are necessary for survival, both are necessary And again, she wrote this right at the height of, a lot of the sort of women's lib movements and so forth that were happening in the 60s and the 70s and such. So again, it's highly received and so forth. One of the things she's going to do in the book is she's actually going to use the male gender for every single person who's on the planet that generally has gone to try to bring in, even though they don't have a male species. Now, she said that the reason she wanted to do that was to challenge male readers, which she figured was going to be a majority of her office, make them feel. She thought about making up a gender for them, but she decided that it would just be easier as an on-ramp to use the male gender for everybody because the majority of her readers are male, like myself. So again, so I appreciate that she was trying to do that and so forth. She basically, her book was very criticized, and there was a lot of conversation from feminist circles and so forth that really sort of, some feminist writers saw this as a very strong feminist style of writing because, again, it kind of analyzed gender stereotypes and so forth. You had a planet where there was no war and so forth, in part because it didn't have, the sort of traditional genders and such, and a lot of the sort of, sort of traditional styles of sexuality, conquering people and so forth. There was no rape. Rape was very rare and so forth, and so was hand-to-hand conflict, and those sorts of things. So on that sort of a planet, and how that society works and so forth are something that feminists definitely were attracted to, but at the same time they didn't like the way that she portrayed genders and so forth. So there's a big kind of push back and forth between feminist writers, and there were some that really embraced this story and this novel, and some that didn't. And a lot of people that did embrace it wrote more things that were feminist science fiction to follow. So this is really kind of the first major feminist science fiction work. And those that did not, but were feminist writers, oftentimes would write their own feminist stuff as counters to this, thus inspiring a genre of people where people are either writing for or against LeGuin's sort of ideas of feminism and gender and stereotypes and such in our society. And again, this is a perfect example then of a book that is trying to challenge our own preconceptions using the science fiction genre as its methodology for having a conversation. In this case, it's about race and I'm sorry, about gender and so forth. It's not about race or anything else like that. It's about gender and gender stereotypes and such. And again, since it's one of the first works to do that, it thus had a huge opportunity to really have an influence on the conversation moving forward. And again, hugely awarded and so forth. I do like it. I think it's well written. Many people will consider this to be LeGuin's sort of classic science fiction work, with, of course, The Wizard of Earthsea being her classic fantasy work, and hold the Earthsea and this up as her two major works that she wrote over her course of her career. She wrote more than 20 novels. She wrote more than 100 short stories and so forth. So she was very prolific during her career, but she would not write, she wasn't publishing books like every 6 months or something like that. She would really dedicate herself to a book, try to do something that was different, something that was unusual, and so forth. And her works will tend to be more of this sort of soft science fiction that kind of explores some aspect of our society and so forth. And I think she does a really good job with it. I think LeGuin is a very strong, very gifted writer, and this is a great, and her example here is a huge opportunity, and it put her on the map in a major way. Again, this was not a normally written science fiction. It's not super fast with tons of action. Again, you're having a guy on a planet that doesn't have war, so you're not going to have all of these fight scenes, all these monsters are attacking him, people that he has to fight or with fisticuffs. It's not that. It kind of actually reminds me, as I'm talking about it now, of the first episode of Star Trek during the same series, and Roddenberry had actually piloted an episode of Star Trek that was kind of a little more talky, and the studio said, we like the idea of Star Trek, but we want there to be more fights, so he rewrote it and recast it with fight scenes and such, and a fist fight at the end and so forth, and he had more fight scenes and more confrontation in it to help out and help sell it to the studio and so forth. Well, this doesn't have fight scenes in every chapter or every episode of the story. That's not this. It's a think piece. It builds the characters over time and so forth. But it goes to, but I think it's probably one of the best examples of character development that I can think of off the top of my head in science fiction. I think it's a very strong written story, and I think that Ursula K. Le Guin's writing style is also very well wedded to this story again. So there you go. That's The Left Hand of Darkness and One of Nebula, One of Hugo. It's on many lists still up through this day for one of the top 10 novels of all time. It started a conversation on gender that really didn't exist in science fiction prior to it being written, and it was also she was also the first woman to win Hugo's and Nebula awards based on, and this was novel. It kind of put her on a map too. Up until this, she was not a major writer. Her works were not always accepted by editors because she'd only been writing for about 8 or 9 years prior to this. So this also put her on the map in a major and permanent way. It also led to sort of this feminism science fiction being written to continue to follow her work or against her work by feminist writers who are really divided among this story. So that's The Left Hand of Darkness. Have you read it? Have you heard of it? If you've heard of it but you've never read of it, I would encourage you to do so. As you can see here, it's not the thickest science fiction book in the world. And my copy here is only about 250 pages long. It probably took me 5 or 6 hours to read. I did read it in 2 sittings because the first time I was on a plane and so forth, so I didn't finish it up until a few days later. So I read it when I was traveling last year and so forth, but it's pretty good. And again, I do like it. And again, it's not that long. It's not this big, giant, thick tome that's going to be like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages. It's going to keep you up like for 10 hours or something like that. So I do encourage you to read it if you've heard of it, but you've never had a chance to. And so you can kind of engage the piece. If you've never heard of it before, then I would also encourage you to do it. It's such an influential science fiction story that I would encourage pretty much any fan of a genre to pick it up and try it out and see what they think of it. So there you go, that's Ursula K's Left Hand of Darkness. Have you read it? I'd love to talk with you about it more. If there's something in the book you want to talk about that I didn't mention here in the review for due to spoilers or anything else, if you agree or disagree with my comments, I'd love to engage you with that more fully in the YouTube video, in the comments below. And if you like this video, there's no reason not to hit the subscribe button. My channel really focuses on sort of these classics of science fiction, fantasy, and horror, particularly ones that are either unknown or people that haven't really challenged themselves to go out and read and so forth. I think this is a good example of probably the second one. Well, I think a lot of science fiction fans may have heard of this, but have never just actually sat down to actually read it and so forth. So I'd challenge you to do so if that's you. And then finally, if you watch this video all the way to its conclusion, I want to thank you for taking some time out of your day, because we all have such busy days and such busy lives. So the fact that you spent these last few minutes with me, it's really touching, and I really appreciate that. So thank you.